Attention, please. Our meeting is ready to continue. Ladies and gentlemen, our speaker is in the hall, so let's get back to our meeting. This is a landmark meeting for the Kips Bay Group. We celebrate our first anniversary. As it's a special event, we have asked a special friend to speak to us tonight. To many of us, he's an old friend, and for some of you, we hope he will become a new one. Usually, the Kips Bay Group is a closed meeting for alcoholics only. Due to tonight's special circumstances, we have opened the meeting to our families and friends. Our only request is that our guests respect the wishes of the group. Those wishes are as follows. What you hear here tonight, take it home with you. Who you see here and meet here, leave that knowledge behind. Anonymity is the spiritual backbone of our program. Again, please help us maintain this spiritual legacy. Before introducing our speaker, I'll read AA's statement of purpose as written in the foreword of the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous. We are not an organization in the conventional sense of the word. There are no fees nor dues whatsoever. The only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. We are not allied with any particular faith, sect, or denomination, nor do we oppose anyone. We simply wish to be helpful to those who are afflicted. And now to our speaker. He has been called the greatest social architect of our century. The 12-step program he developed, America's greatest invention. His extraordinary energy and action were a major contribution to the success of our fellowship. Without that contribution, we would, more than likely, not be here tonight. Lord knows where I would be. It can be said of Bill that there were moments in his life, and he gave his life to those moments. Please welcome the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous to share some of those moments with us tonight. Please welcome Bill W. Bill.
Make it tonight. Some of you, I think, in the hall are aware of what happened today. We received some very, very sad news. We expected it, but it's still a great shock. Here, let me read the telegram that we got about 12 o'clock, 12:30. Mr. William G. Wilson, the Alcoholic Foundation, New York, New York. Dear Uncle Bill, Dad slipped away peacefully at noon today at the Akron hospital. We'll call you later this evening with the funeral arrangements. Our love to you and Aunt Lois, and it's signed Sue and Bob Jr. Dr. Bob, my partner, your friend, died today. He'd been sick for a very, very long time. I was not going to come. We've been trying all day to arrange for a flight out from Idlewild to Akron, but with this Korean War mess on, we just can't get any flights. So we've settled on catching a train later this evening to Cleveland. We'll drive down tomorrow. I understand some of the members of the group are going to come out for a memorial service and funeral on Saturday. I'll see you there. My wife Lois, though, she said to me, Bill, go to the meeting. What better place could you go to than a meeting of Bob's friends? I even got a call from Ed Dowling, Father Ed down in St. Louis, and Ed said, go to the meeting. He said, go, by all means. And don't just talk about yourself, talk about Bob. It'll help you. It really will. He said, make it an Irish wake. I thought about that, and I think he's right also. So that's what I'd like to do tonight. I normally just tell my story. I call it a bedtime story because it usually puts people to sleep. But tonight, I'd like to tell Bob's story also, our story. So if you bear with me, I might be a little scattered. I did, though, take a minute on the way over to write a few notes to sort of commemorate what's going on here with this group's anniversary. So let me read this and we'll get the meeting on. My friends in AA and of AA, we meet tonight to celebrate this group's anniversary, the Kips Bay group, and the life of Robert Holbrook Smith, Dr. Bob Smithy. We are here to thank God for the freedom that he has given us, taking us out of the bondage that we were in. And we want to thank all our friends, express to them our deep gratitude for all they have done in helping us with this wholesale miracle of recovery, and to share with them and with each other the sure evidence of God's grace among us. So much for speeches. We don't make speeches. Where do I begin? I guess for me it would be 16 years ago, 1934. I was a patient up at Charlie Towns' hospital up on Central Park West. I had been a patient there before. This was my fourth trip into that hospital, third time that year to be detoxified, to be made sober. And while I was upstairs wrapped up in Charlie's canvas pajama top, the ones that used to tie in the back, my wife was downstairs talking to Dr. Silkworth. And Silky was telling her what he had just maybe an hour or so before that told me. He was telling her that my drinking, which had once been a habit, had now become an obsession. And that my body, after years of living in this obsession, had developed an allergy to the very substance that I craved. He was telling her that I had a malady that he called alcoholism. After treating thousands of men like myself, he found this malady, and he said, of course, there was no cure for it. And it was his best suggestion that she place me in the Rockland State Hospital for the insane as a chronic inebriate. They could do that in those days for the rest of my life, however long or short that life might be. And Lois, just not listening to the doctor, all she could say was, but why, doctor? Why can't Bill stop drinking? Why, when he makes up his mind to do anything, why can't he stop drinking? You never met a more obstinate man. The doctor just had to repeat because he can't. He has a disease. Hard to understand, harder to treat, but a disease nevertheless. And that I was cooked. And I'm upstairs thinking about what he said, and I really felt cooked. I mean, I'd come out of the hallucinations, and the DTs had already been and gone, and I was just mulling over what had happened to me. Where did it all go wrong? And I look back at my life. What a ending. I had been very successful. I was a #1 man. I mean, I had acquired a fortune, lost it. Lost it as a result of bad judgment and drinking too much. Had married, I was a college man. Been an officer, served our country in the First World War. Was honorable, had friends, a man of my word, a man of means, had at one time great wealth, and I lost it all. I just couldn't figure it out. But I didn't quite agree with the doctor. Much as I loved him, he was a wonderful man. He was very kind to me. I did not agree with him. And when I finally did get to talk to Lois the next day, I begged her not to follow the doctor's advice. Please, don't listen to him. Give me one more chance. And she did. And she brought me home. Our home those days was my brother-in-law's house on Clinton Street in Brooklyn. We'd lost everything. We're living rent-free. Lois had a job in a department store, downtown Brooklyn, making $22 a week. That was our sole income. We had sold, pawned everything we had. I was just a terminal drunk. But I got sober. I proved the doctor wrong. For the next 2 months, I walked from one room to the next, from the basement to the attic, day in and day out, forcing myself not to go outside. because I knew if I went outside, I'd get drunk. I stayed locked up in that house, day in and day out, fighting off that obsession to go out and get drunk. And finally, I was sober. And I felt great. I mean, I proved conclusively that Dr. Silkworth had made a mistake, as far as I was concerned. He was still a brilliant man. And then one morning, Armistice Day, 1934, I looked out the window. Lois was getting ready to go to work in that damn department store, and I saw that it was just a positively brilliant day, magnificent day. And I realized that this was probably going to be the last good day of the year. And I better take it in. And if I'm going to take it in, I should play a game of golf. I had access to my brother-in-law's club over in Staten Island. He was a doctor, and he paid my bills. So I told Lois, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to play golf today. I felt like $1 million. Physically, I was like a 20-year-old. I really felt wonderful, truly. And Lois, very reluctant. She begged me at first, don't go, please. Get better. Become more well. You just don't chance it. And I said, no, honey, I knew the doctor was wrong. I could do it. Finally, I won her over. Even to the tune of a couple of dollars. She gave me a couple of dollars so I'd have some money in my pocket. And I dug the clubs out of the attic, and I walked down to the ferry to save the car fare and took it across to Staten Island. Magnificent day. I felt so wonderful. When I got on the bus at the ferry terminal on the other side, I happened to notice a man carrying a rifle. Now, I don't know about you, but in New York, if I see somebody with a gun, I want to keep a good eye on him. So I sat alongside him. Me with my golf bag between my legs and him with his rifle between his legs. And after a few stops, I said to him, hey, mister, what are you doing with the rifle? And as it turned out, he was going to a shooting match at a gun club, shooting club, right next door to the very golf course that I was going to play on. Well, being raised in Vermont, I felt I knew everything there ever was written about a rifle. Hunted all my life. So I proceeded to tell him everything I knew. And wouldn't you know it, he knew a little bit more than I did. And he began to tell me back, and I was kind of a little short of change there. So having served in the artillery during the First World War, I threw that in, talked about big guns. And wouldn't you know it, I became #1 in the conversation. He was impressed. I knew a lot about ballistics. So it was a very engaging conversation. When all of a sudden, the bus was creamed in the back. Somebody ran into the back, a taxi cab. Not much damage. We all had to get off to look at it, and we're perusing it and getting ready to get back on board the bus when the driver says, I'm sorry, please, we can't leave the scene of the accident because I have to fill out a report. So we're standing on the curb, my newfound friend and I, waiting for the police to come so we can fill out the report. What they did, though, is they called for a replacement bus. And my friend, he spots a saloon across the street. And he says, why don't we wait in the bar? He says, no sense standing out here. We look very conspicuous with my gun and your golf clubs. Why don't we go over there and wait in the bar? And I thought that was a good idea. I didn't ever want to be conspicuous. So we crossed the street and we got into the bar and we sat up on the bar stools, and the bartender came over and he says, what will you have, gentlemen? And my friend said, he'll have a whiskey and ginger ale. And of me, he said, what would you like? And I said, just a ginger ale, thank you. My newfound friend says, you don't drink? I said, no, I don't. Then for some reason, I began to tell him my life story with alcohol, blow by blow, loss upon loss, everything that happened to me in the maybe 17 years that I drank. I was now 39. I picked up my first drink when I was 22. And he listened. When I finished, he said, you know, he said, you're fantastic. And right away, I knew he was brilliant. I mean, I knew that this was a very smart man because he could determine that. He could determine that about me. Nobody, and I mean this in years, had a kind word to say about me, but this guy could see through all of this, and he knew that I was remarkable, fantastic. He said, I have a great many friends that have had the same curse that you had, but they succumbed to it. They're in nut houses, they're in graveyards, they're in prisons, or they're locked up in their homes, or they're lost. But you seem to have overcome your handicap. You know, you're outstanding. And the more he talked, the smarter he got, right in front of my eyes. It was so wholesome for me, because I felt so good. Well, the bus driver came, and we got on a new bus, and we continued our trip. And as I said, nobody had a good word to say about me in years, so I didn't want to let go of him. I didn't want to, don't turn him loose. So I suggested that he join me for lunch at my club. Why don't you come to my club for about a lunch? He wasn't going to start shooting until 2 o'clock. I wasn't to tee off until 1:30. It was just a few minutes before noon. Join me for some lunch. We can continue the conversation. You can continue, I didn't say this, you can continue to say great things about me, and we'll have a lovely, lovely lunch. And he agreed. He only had to, when we finished, walk through the back door and cross over a little field, and he'd be at his gun club, plenty of time to blaze away. So we walked into the clubhouse together, and we were walking to the dining room, and the manager came up and he said, gentlemen, can I help you? And I said, no, we're just going in for some lunch. He said, oh, I'm sorry. He says, you can't have lunch today in the dining room. It's closed in honor of Armistice Day. We've given the help the day off. But you can, if you'd like, get a sandwich in the bar. We've kept that open. And my friend said to me, will that bother you? And I said, of course not. I passed the test. There's nothing to worry about. We'll go in and have a sandwich. We went in again, sat up in the bar, and he ordered a whiskey and ginger ale, and again I ordered a ginger ale, and we ordered some sandwiches and continued the conversation. But right away again he said, you're just too much. You're positively brilliant. You're in a sea of alcohol, and the place was loaded with liquor bottles of every variety you could name, all over the place. Mirrored, so you got a double impact. All I could see was liquor. He said, you're in a sea of this stuff, and you can turn it down. I mean, you're something. And I can't describe that feeling, self-worth. We drank our drinks, my ginger ale, his highball, and we ordered and ate our sandwiches and had a nice time. Finally, when it was over, I called for the bartender to bring the check so I could sign it. That way my brother wouldn't have any trouble paying it, my brother-in-law. We're about ready to leave when the bartender came over and he put down 2 mixed drinks. One in front of me and one in front of my friend. And he said, gentlemen, these drinks are on the house in celebration of Armistice Day. Without a moment's hesitation, I reached over and I picked up my drink and I drank it down. When I turned to my newfound friend, he didn't look so smart anymore. He had the dumbest expression I've ever seen on a human being. Mouth wide open. All he could say is, mister, you gotta be crazy. After what you've told me that alcohol did to you, you've got to be insane to drink that drink. And all I could say was, you're right, I am insane. I am. Lois found me that night in the areaway between the front door and the inside door of the house. I had fallen and cut my head. I was bleeding, passed out, still clutching that unused bag of golf clubs. I didn't play golf that day. I got drunk. Proved the doctor right. Next morning, when I woke up, realized what had happened to me, I knew I was an alcoholic and that I'd be one all my life. And when I died, I'd be a dead alcoholic. As they pulled the grass over my head, that's what I'd be. And there was nothing I could do about it. But I'll be damned if I'm going to die in some booby hatch. I made up my mind right then and there that I would rather drink myself to death or get the Dutch courage to take my life. I had tried it a couple of times, but backed away at the last minute. That's what I intended to do. From that day on, I begged and I borrowed and I stole the dollar bill that it took every day to get the 3 little bottles of bootleg gin that put me over the edge. And I sat in my kitchen, day in and day out, drinking myself blind, my wife off working, drinking myself into oblivion, into death, writing angry letters to Franklin Delano Roosevelt telling him what a lousy job he was doing running the country, to which he never replied, by the way. Typical Democrat, you know. But that was my goal in life. This is what I had summed up 39 years to do. And I couldn't care less. That's how Ebie found me. Some of you might know Ebie from the rooms. Got a call one day. Hey, Bill, it's Ebie. Can I come over to see you? Oh, Ebie T. Ebie, my school chum, my old drinking buddy. Oh, a voice out of the past. Hadn't seen him in maybe 6 months. Please, Ebie, come over. I hated to drink alone. I truly did. I didn't like my own company. Oh, please come over, Ebie. I'd love to see you. And then I made ready for my friend. I even did something wondrous for me, I think pretty heroic. I dug out the one little bottle of gin that I always kept for an emergency that was tucked away behind the toilet in the downstairs bathroom. I put that on the kitchen table. And because I knew Ebie had a kind of a sour stomach, I rescued a can of pineapple juice out of the cupboard, and I opened that up and I poured both into a pitcher to sort of cut the pain of the bootleg, you know, the gin. And I waited for my friend, trying to recall some conversation I had just recently about him that was, I think, fairly scandalous. And it came out of the blue. I had heard some bad news about Ebie, and I'm trying to figure out what it was, and I realized Ebie was in some sort of motor accident up in Albany. And he, friends reported to me, he was a little tipsy, and he drove his car into somebody's living room, I believe, and when he climbed out, he said to the woman on the sofa, would you please get me a cup of coffee? And she called the cops instead. I must ask him, how did he get out of that scrape? That, his dad's mayor of Albany. I mean, that doesn't help the name, you know. Oh, I have to talk to him. Well, I didn't have long to wait. Doorbell rang, and I went out and I opened it up, and there was Ebie. And right away, I knew there was something different about him. I just couldn't quite pin it down. He was clean, which was unusual for him. His clothes were clean and well pressed. His hat was blocked. His shoes were shined. And he had something in his eye that just told me that there was some change occurred with him. And we shared some pleasantries in the parlor, and I finally said to him, maybe why don't we go back to the kitchen where it's a lot warmer, where I knew the bottle was. Why don't we go back there and we can renew old times and have a pleasant afternoon, just sharing. And he followed me, and we got in, and we sat at the kitchen table, and after a few more minutes of just small talk, I said to him, how would you like a little drink here? Would you care for a little doozy? And I started to pour it out, and he said, no, Bill, he said, not today, thank you. Are you on the water wagon, Ebie? I said, are you on the water wagon? He said, no, Bill, I'm just not drinking today. So I guess you could say I got religion. Oh, my God. I let a nut in my house. Hang on, Ebie. I took a belt. I realized this guy traded in his dipsomania for religiomania. I'm in for a tough afternoon. And then the thought occurred to me, it's not so bad, because this is all mine now. I don't have to share it. And I can suffer the pineapple juice, you know. It isn't going to bother me. Well, I was taught by my mother and my grandparents to be very courteous, so I said to him, Ebie, what kind of religion have you got? You might as well ask him. Well, Billy says, I guess you could call it the religion of common sense. I had never heard of Our Lady of the Common Sense, so I dug a little further. I said, what do you mean, the religion of common sense? He said, well, Bill, he said, I don't know if you were aware of the fact that alcohol, booze, had a really tight grip on it. And right away I knew I wasn't going to be able to talk about that motor accident because I said, Ebie, you having a problem with alcohol? I had no idea. He said, oh yeah, he said, I was in bad shape. They were getting ready to lock me up and throw the key away. I had been in so many scrapes. I mean, I was in deep doo. I mean, I really was. And then he said, I was in the judge's chambers, and friends of ours, and he mentioned their names, and they were friends of mine, and a complete stranger, and he mentioned his name, and he was a stranger to me. He said, they came to that hearing. And this stranger said to the judge, Your Honor, turn him over to us. We think we can help him. These fellows are members of the Oxford group. Have you ever heard of them? And I said, oh yeah, I had read every once in a while in some of the newspapers a meeting or so in some hotel by some personality that got saved by the Oxford group. But I gave it short shift. I didn't believe in any of that. I said, yeah, I've heard a little bit about it, but not enough to be interested, Ebie. He said, well, he said, I got interested. He said, and I've been working with this guy for about 5 weeks, and I haven't had a drink. See, what I did is, he said, I took certain ideas peculiar to them, and I put it to work on my drinking problem, and it seems to have done the trick for me. Well, again, you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. I said, what are those ideas, Ebie? He said, well, number one, he said, I got honest with myself for the first time in my life, and I took a look at what drinking had done to me. Self-examination, I have no argument with that. That sounds fine to me. He said, and then, Bill, I became willing to talk it over with somebody else, in strict confidence now, mind you, in strict confidence. I talked about what my life had been like. Confession is good for the soul. I have no argument with that. He said, and then, Bill, he said, I became willing to make up for all the damage that I've done, to make amends, to pay back. I'll be doing that the rest of my life. And then I tried to remember if he owed me any money. Maybe I could remind him of it. But he didn't. I said, that sounds pretty good. And he said, then also, Bill, he said, I also became willing to help people like myself. And when I heard that Bill Wilson is tucked away over in Brooklyn Heights, drinking himself to death, I asked my friends if I could come over and talk to you. And they felt I was strong enough, so I'm here today. And I said, I have no idea where you got the idea I was having a problem with alcohol, Ebie. I mean, you're sort of off ground here. I mean, I'm doing all right. Oh, he said, well, if I'm mistaken, I'll apologize. You know, he said, but then he said, Bill, there's one other idea I want to tell you about, and I know it's going to jar you, but I've got to tell you about it. I had to also come up with whatever God I could to ask him for help to do those other 4 things. And he mentioned the God word, and I said, thanks, but no thanks. I'll see you. And he got up and he left. I walked him to the door. So much for a pleasant afternoon. The idea of somebody coming into my house and talking about a personal deity, somebody or something that you could call on to help you in a jackpot situation, was absolutely ridiculous. What nonsense. What fanaticism. What a waste. I believed, as an engineer, in the natural order of things. My wife was a Swedenborgian. You figure that one out. I used to take after my grandfather. I guess you could say I was an Ingersoll-inclined fundamentalist or transcendentalist. We used to go to stump meetings up in some of the campgrounds in Vermont when I was a kid. But the idea of a personal relationship with something that helps you, no, forget it. I went back to drinking. But a funny thing happened. I couldn't get the sight of Ebie out of my mind. Him sober, and I knew what I looked like, and I knew what I felt like. And I couldn't figure out the why. I should be sober. Ebie should be the drunk. Because I always figured I was a lot smarter than he was. But something's screwy here. I'm the drunk. And the more I thought about it, the more obsessed I became. The more obsessed I became, the more I thought about his message. And then it dawned on me through my alcoholic haze one day that had I cancer, and my friend came to me one day and said to me, I have a cure for cancer, and it involves the great physician, I would crawl to him on my hands and knees. And I knew that I had a disease as deadly as cancer, and I wouldn't do anything about it. I wouldn't. That's insanity. And I became more obsessed until finally, my background was as a field investigator. I guess you could say I was one of the first security analysts in Wall Street, so I decided to apply that. I would investigate the Oxford group. And if they added up to something, I would check it out a lot further. I would go over and I would spy on them and see what they were up to, and if perhaps they could help me. I told Lois about my idea the next day, and with her help, we cleaned me up. And I got a few dollars off her again, and that afternoon I went into Manhattan from Brooklyn, took the subway in. When I came up out of the subway, I realized I had made a mistake. They used to meet at the old Calvary Mission, the old mission on 23rd Street. And I was on the east side, and I come up out of the subway, I'm on the west side, which happens to be the longest stretch of the city, the widest part. When I realized my mistake, I just said, well, why don't you walk? I had plenty of time. The meeting, the sharing wasn't going to begin until 7 o'clock. So I proceeded to walk across town. It was a brisk day. I felt good. Got a couple of blocks when I found myself looking into some of the saloons along 23rd Street to see if perhaps there'd be somebody there I knew. There was nobody there. Finally, in desperation, you could say, I crossed the street to what was always a favorite watering hole of mine, to really look in that window, and after taking a deep look, not recognizing a soul, I decided to enter and take another deeper look, more meaningful one. So I walked in, looked around. Nobody there I knew. So I decided I'd wait. Maybe somebody would show up. And if you're going to wait in a bar, you should have a drink. So I had a beer, and then another beer, and then a little shot to chase the beer. Before you know it, I forgot any plans that I had for an evening that hadn't even begun yet. It was about 5 o'clock, 5:30. I went into a blackout. It was my custom then, after a few drinks. But about an hour later, as also was my custom, I came out of the blackout. And I found myself listening to a man with a very, very thick accent. Could barely understand a word he was saying. And I discovered that he was from Finland, and that he worked as a sailmaker on a fishing boat. And then I realized he was a fisherman. And it dawned on me that I was in town to meet fishers of men, not a fisherman. I was in New York to meet God. That came through the haze. It was Alec the Finn. Some of you might remember him. He went back to Finland in '42. So I grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and I said, "Mister, we're going to meet God." And he followed me because I had a couple of dollars in my pocket. And we walked the few remaining blocks. The meeting was just about ready to begin. Tex Francisco was standing at the door, the old drunk. And he barred us. He wouldn't let us in. And push was coming to shove. And I was getting ready to get my usual beating when who would show up but Ebie? And he sponsored us in. He said, "I'll sit on these two guys. And if they act up, I'll get them right out." And Tex said, go right ahead, you're responsible. And he got us into the meeting. For those of you who remember the old mission with the slat benches, row after row, and up front they had the big coffee urn with the big pot of baked beans and the tin plates. And he sat us down and he filled up a plate of beans and a mug of coffee, and I can still recall the smell. It was overwhelming. The urine-soaked bodies, their waste stuck to their bodies, living in the clothes for the last year. Poor, pathetic creatures. Me and my Brooks, looking like $1 million, drunk as a skunk. I sat among them, and at first I was a little touchy about it. But then I guess it was the beans in my stomach and the coffee, but I began to mellow out. And I began to realize that these were not a bad bunch of boys, a little bit further down on the ladder than I was, but they seemed to be all right. Men are men, you know, they were very cordial to me. I just mellowed out. Wouldn't you know it, I went back into another blackout. Because what happened after that was reported to me by my friend Ebie in my living room back in Brooklyn Heights the next day. But it seems that halfway through somebody's witness up front, I got up with the fin again by the back of the neck and came forward and accepted Christ. As I was told, I was up front playing the tambourine, singing some old camp songs, trying to jerk everybody up for Jesus, and having a great old time. I gave witness myself. They listened to me. Apparently I was spellbinding, as I usually am when I'm drunk, because I never remember it. And when Ebie told me what I had done the next day, I knew that that was the beginning of my insanity. I was on the hot road right now, the highway to the loony bin, because I didn't believe in any of that. The idea of me getting up in front of, that was absolutely ludicrous. I didn't believe a word that was told back to me. What insanity. And all Ebie said is, you had me fooled, boy. I was up clapping for you, too. I was so happy. And all I knew is that I was condemned never again to go into Manhattan. Because the idea of some drunk coming up to me and say, boy, you were great that night at the mission. I mean, I was mortified. I didn't. And Ebie left. And I moped around the house, sick and sorry. And about 10 o'clock, an hour after he left, Lois was off working in that damn department store. I realized that morning when she was going to work, I gave her money. Handed over money. Took it out of my pocket and said, here, honey, take this. I don't need it. I had come home with money in my pocket. I hadn't done that in years. I could never go by a bar with a dime in my pocket when I was drinking. And yet, something must have happened to me, because I surrendered the money back to her. I said, something did occur. What it was, I don't know. So I decided I'd check it out a little further. I said, I'll get sober first. I'll go into Charlie Towns' hospital, spend the 5 days. It cost my brother-in-law $125. He always paid the bill. I would go in there, sober up, and after I was sobered up, I'd go back and check these people out to see what happened to me. Now, I don't know about you, but if you're going to get sober, you should get drunk first, and all I had was a hangover. And I wasn't going to waste $125 getting cured from a hangover. But darn it, I gave all my money back to my wife. All I had in my pocket was 6 cents, a nickel and a penny, and it took a nickel to get it on the subway. So that left you with a penny. And believe me, in '34, you couldn't get drunk, even in Brooklyn, with a penny. I needed a little bit more money. I didn't have a sou in the house. Finally, I shopped around Brooklyn Heights until I came to the one store that would give me credit. Actually, it was on Lois's tick, but I got 4 quarts of beer. Drank 2 right away because I had a terrible thirst. Tried to give 1 away on the subway, the guy wouldn't take it, so I drank that. Wound up staggering into Charlie Towns' hospital with the 1 bottle of beer over my head, and I spot Dr. Silkworth, and I said, Silky, I found the cure. I'm talking about the Oxford group, but he sees the beer, he sees me, and he says, Bill, you know where your room is, go to bed. And believe me, I'd been there a number of times, I knew where my room was. I went up, finished the beer, and went to bed. 3 days later, I'm free of alcohol, free of sedatives now, I'm in that hospital room, feeling absolutely terrible, terribly depressed. I've had a problem with depression all my life, but that day was a doozy. I was really, really down, laying in that bed. I had done it again. I had no intention of checking out the Oxford group. None whatsoever. What nonsense. It's just another drunken hallucination. And I'm lying in bed when I look up, and standing in the doorway is my friend Ebie. And the first thing I said to myself was, here's a man that practices what he preaches. I had heard the staff, when they had come on that evening, talking about how cold it was outside. And here was my friend come out in that cold to see me. I said, this guy really believes in what he's doing. And all he said to me is, gee, Bill, I'm sorry to see you in this state. I thought you had it the other day. I truly did. You know, if there's anything I can ever do for you, please give me a call. And he turned to leave, and I said, wait a minute, my friend. I said, what was that neat little formula you had that helped you achieve your sobriety? And he said, well, easy. He says, you get honest, you talk it over with somebody else. He said, you make up for the harm you've done, help other people, and then, of course, ask whatever God you can come up with for the help to do those 4 things. Oh, the God word. I'm sorry. Please, I won't take your time. Thank you very much. He mentioned God again, and forget about it. I was stuck. I mean, really, it stuck right here. I couldn't do anything. And he left. He didn't argue. And I continued to lay in that bed, and the evening came down on me like thunder, and it got very, very dark in that room. As I lay there, I again reviewed everything that happened in my life that centered around alcohol, of course, and it just got worse and worse and worse. And so eventually it felt as if I was in a deep, deep, dark pit at the bottom of just blackness. And then for one brief moment, one of the moments that Jack mentioned when he introduced me, for one brief moment, my proud obstinacy left me. And I found myself crying out, I said more in sadness than in pain, if there is a God, let him show himself to me right now. I will do anything, anything. Immediately the room lit up in an intense white light, and I was caught up in an ecstasy that words cannot describe. In my mind's eye, it was as if I were on a mountaintop, and a wind, not of air, but of spirit, flowed through my body. And it burst upon me that I was a free man. The obsession to drink that ruled my life left me. Eventually, the ecstasy subsided, and now I'm back in that bed, in that hospital, but this time I'm surrounded in a presence of pure joy. And all I could say is, I realized I was a part. This is this number one man and everything. I was a part, if only a tiny part, of a universe that was ruled in justice and love by a loving, compassionate, personal God. And all I could say was, so this is the God of the preachers. This is what they talk about. Well, I have one of these inquiring, rational minds, and it began to seep in. This little experience lasted maybe 7 minutes, 10 minutes at the most. That I was going crazy. This was an hallucination. This was the beginning, the slide into madness, alcohol psychosis. I was at the end. And I became frightened. I mean, really frightened. And I called the nurse to get Dr. Silkworth. I begged her, and she could see my anxiety, and she went and she woke him up, and she brought him to my bed, and he sat alongside me, and as best I could, I described what I just told you about. And he listened, and he didn't say a word. He just listened, and finally, I don't know where the courage came from, I said to him, Doctor, am I insane? Is this it? God forgive me, it took a long time, but finally, he said to me, no, my boy. He says, you're not insane. I have never witnessed what has happened to you, but I've read about it in the books, and it does sober up drunks. And I can tell you this, I saw you no more than an hour or so ago, and I wouldn't have given you a tinker's damn for your life. But something has happened, and you better hang on to it, because it's all you've got. And he left. And I slept like a baby that night. Best night's sleep I ever got in my life. Like a baby. Next morning, Ebie showed up, and I told him what happened to me, and he listened. He said, I'll be right back. And he came back shortly, and with him he brought a book by Dr. James, William James, a Harvard psychologist, called The Variety of Religious Experiences. And he said, Bill, he said, you'll find what happened to you in this book, the cash value. And I devoured the book, the toughest book I ever read in my life, but I read it from front to back. And in it, I found what had happened to me. And this good doctor describes these events to certain people, some the sudden type, whether it's an illuminating light, or it's a sound, or it's an out-of-body experience. These conversion experiences, the sudden type that happened to me, that alter the course of your life. And then he goes on to describe experiences people had that were gradual, over a period of time, in fellowship, in service, in company with other people, that undergo the same spiritual experience, the same religious experience, that alters the course of their life for the good. But no matter whether it's sudden or gradual, each and every one of them, though, has one common ingredient. We're all of us in a state of calamity, powerlessness. Our lives have become unmanageable. We are at the bottom. We have hit bottom before this can begin. And this is what happened to me. And then, right after that, typically alcoholic, I said, but why me? I mean, why did this happen to me? I mean, I certainly didn't deserve it. I can't think of anything I've ever done that warranted this. What put me on this path? Why was this message from my friend Ebie to set up a series of events that was to lead in my having this experience? What was it? Then I realized my drinking had so isolated me in my life. It was as if I was in a cave of loneliness, a cave of isolation. And for years, my family, my wife, God bless her, stood outside that cave and said, Bill, will you come out? Come out of there. Don't stay there. And I couldn't get out. I couldn't find my way out. And then one day my friend Ebie showed up and stood outside that cave. And having been a captive in a similar cave, he could, from recent memory, enter my cave, take me by the hand, and lead me out. He knew the way. One cave dweller helping another, one alcoholic helping another, because he knew the way. And I realized that that's what I wanted to do the rest of my life, is to help other cave dwellers, other alcoholics. So I left the hospital, and I joined the Oxford group. And I came forth to save the world. For the next 6 months, I talked to thousands of drunks all over the east side of New York and in Brooklyn. And it got to the point that when they saw me coming, they ran the other way. Because I was totally convinced that if they were going to get sober, they had to hit some sort of mountaintop and have a wind go through their body that was going to be a doozy and have this white light. And they kept going like this when I was talking, and all they wanted to know is, what were you drinking the day you had this flash, Bill? We don't want to touch that stuff. I mean, I couldn't sober up anybody. I brought one poor soul home to my house, and he got to heaven the quick way. He put his head in my oven. I mean, nobody got sober with anything I had to say, and I couldn't figure it out. Finally, I went back to Silkworth after 6 months, almost 6 months. And I said to him, Silky, what am I doing wrong? Ebie can get me sober, and I know I'm still smarter than he is. Why can't I sober up anybody? And he hit me right between the eyes. He says, I'm going to give you some advice, Bill. He says, I've listened to you talk to some of our charity cases. We'd never turn you loose on a paying customer. He said, I've listened to you, and he says, I got one suggestion, you can take it or leave it. I said, I'll do anything. What can I do? He said, lay off the God business. I said, what? He said, don't talk about God to a drunk. Talk drunk to a drunk. Talk about the lying, the stealing, the cheating. Talk about what you've lost in life. And when you make that identification, when you got the guy listening to you because he knows in your heart, in his heart, that you're talking the same language, when you make that connection, then tell him about the conversion. Then talk about the spiritual aspects. But make the connection first. I couldn't believe it, but I decided to start practicing what he suggested. And they stopped running away. They didn't get sober, but they hung around. And then finally, friends of ours, Lois and I, said, when is Bill going to go back to work and get Lois out of that damn department store? And I heard about it. And I began to hang around some of the brokerage houses down on Wall Street that I was familiar with, like Macabre, waiting for a good deal to come along. And next thing you know, I heard about a little thing going on in Akron, Ohio, a little... That's a very vital part of our fellowship, and it's also very personal, how we treat our own anonymity. I just want to take the opportunity whenever I can to suggest, though, that you please never allow it to come between you and your ability to help another suffering human being, which is the magic, the magnificent reality of Alcoholics Anonymous. Don't be too anonymous. Don't be as anonymous as a friend of mine up in our home group. He's so anonymous, his sponsor doesn't know he's in the program, so you don't want to get that deep. In 1935, May, Akron, I guess it still is, Akron was a city divided into itself. Headquarters for 3 of the largest tire companies in the world. It was a Firestone, Goodyear, and Goodrich. It was a very, very competitive city and very secretive because they were all developing bigger and better tires, so nobody talked to anybody. If you worked for Goodyear and your neighbor worked for Goodrich, you couldn't talk to him, or Firestone couldn't talk to you. So nobody spoke to anybody. And I show up with a bunch of pirates from New York intent on taking over a machine company that does business with all 3 of those companies. A plum, a real plum. And we were going to seize the company by proxy because they were having some management problems. We thought we could take it over. And they put me to work as an investigator to see if we could develop some inside information that would help us do this. But as I said, they didn't talk to each other. They certainly weren't going to talk to us. We were from New York. I mean, we just were shut out totally. We couldn't get a bit of information. Well, another group, a rival group, came in from Chicago, and because they were Midwesterners, they had a sort of inside edge, and they won the proxy battle. We lost. And lo and behold, there I was the day before Mother's Day, 1935, walking up and down the lobby of the hotel, the Mayflower, waiting for Monday. I had told my friends, they had gone back to New York, let me stay in town to see if there was any malfeasance, any misfeasance, any illegality. And if there was, perhaps we could sue the winning company and recover our investment, our expenses, and maybe a little profit. And they had nothing to lose. The hotel bill was paid forward for a couple of days. They said, stay. You can stay. And there I was, broken-hearted, dejected, feeling very, very sorry for myself, Because had we been successful, I would have become president of the company. I would have made a lot of money, I would have paid my debts, and of course I would have gotten my wife out of that damn department store. But we lost. So I'm walking up and down the lobby of the hotel. One end was the desk clerk, and at the other end was a bar. Just pacing, waiting for Monday. The only attraction in town was a film with Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, and called Roberta, I believe. And I liked her, but I didn't like him, so I didn't want to go to the movie. So I'm just pacing. And before you know it, I'm no longer pacing. I'm standing outside the bar, listening to the sounds that bars make. You're familiar with them, the tinkle of glasses, laughter, the cash register, some light music. Saying to myself, Bill, why don't you go in, have a ginger ale, and strike up a conversation? Pass the time. Make some acquaintances. Would help just get you to Monday. As soon as I said this, I realized I didn't want to pass the time. I wanted to get drunk. I had $10 in my pocket. 1935, $10 would make you king for a day in Akron, especially. I mean, that was a lot of money. I wanted to get drunk. What then was keeping me sober? What was keeping me sober? Working with other drunks. Even though I wasn't successful. When I did that, I didn't have any thought of drinking. I need to find a drunk in Akron. I need him more than he needs me. But where do you find, I mean, where? I can't go in the bar. I mean, they'll beat me up if I start trying to sober them up. Where do you find a drunk? I didn't know a soul. So I continued my pacing, but then eventually I found myself between the lobby and the bar was a pillar, and on the pillar was a church directory. I began to look at the names, just pass the time, when all of a sudden, down near the bottom, up leapt the name, the Reverend Walter Tunks. And right away, when I was a kid growing up in Vermont, when we took a walk in the woods, we took a tunk. I said, I'll play that hunch. I'll call this fella and see if he can help me. And I dialed the number. For you bowlers out there, it was what they call a 10 strike. I was able to get a hold of the #1 fan of the Oxford groups in Akron. #1 fan. Reverend Walter Tunks, Episcopalian minister. Wasn't a member himself, but he thought highly of them. And I told him, I'm a rum hound from New York, member of the OG, sober now over 6 months, almost 6 months. I like to get a hold of a drunk, maybe I can sober him up. And the good reverend, at first he was a little reluctant. He knew drunks, he didn't want to tie two together. One at a time was bad enough, but and then I talked a little bit more, and he realized what I wanted to do, and he said, well, listen, he said, I don't know any myself, and if I did, in confidence, I couldn't tell you. He said, but I do know members of the Oxford group, and he gave me 10 names and 10 numbers. He said, call them, they might have a drunk or two who can help you. So I cashed a $1 bill, and I got 20 nickels, and I sat in the phone booth, and I just dialed number after number, and I went through 9 in the space of maybe 15 minutes. They either hung up on me, they didn't answer, there was nobody home, or they just didn't know anybody. I mean, I was down to the last name. Took a deep breath, and I called that person. He answered. As it turned out, he was packing to leave town. He was already late. He said, I can't help you. He said, I don't know. And he says, here, call this woman. And he gave me her name, Henrietta Seiberling, and my heart sank right down to my gut. Henrietta Seiberling. That's got to be Frank Seiberling's wife, the guy that started Goodyear. I knew him. We were members of the same clubs in New York. I can't call him and say, Frank, this is Bill Wilson. I'm a drunk now. Do you know any drunks? I just couldn't do it. It was just impossible. Don't ever ask me to even think about that. And I sat in that phone booth, and I knew that if I didn't do it, I'd get up and I'd walk out and I'd get drunk. So I took another deep breath, and I dropped the nickel in, and I dialed the number, and Henrietta answered. Henry. And I told her I was a rum hound from New York, a member of the Oxford group, and I think I could help somebody get sober. And she said, come right over. And I came right over. She wasn't Frank's wife. She was his daughter-in-law, soon-to-be ex-daughter-in-law. She didn't live in the mansion on Portage Road. She lived in a little gatehouse. She'd moved there so her children could be close to their father. They were going through a divorce. The young heir had found a showgirl. He was getting rid of number one and making room for number two. Henry had been in this struggle for almost 2 years now. That's when she had embraced the Oxford group, when it began. She was so spiritually low. Now, the Oxford group, let me point this out. This was not a religion. This was a evangelical fundamentalist movement of its time that their original name was First Century Christian Fellowship. They were a group of people that got together in a fashion they thought most emulated what it was like for early Christians shortly after the death of Christ. They would just get together and comfort each other spiritually, help each other out. You were suggested to maintain your own religious affiliation. But you came to these meetings, we used to call them house parties or drawing room conversations. And you'd meet in homes or in hotels sometimes, in church basements, and you just share. People just shared what was going on in their life, and people prayed together and meditated and helped each other, guided each other through these difficult times. And that's what Henry had been involved in. And just 2 weeks prior to my call, at one of their sharings, a well-known surgeon in Akron, a lovely man, admitted to his group that he had a drinking problem. His name was Dr. Bob Smith. Henry was a friend of his wife, Ann's, for a number of years. Loved her very, very dearly. She loved Bob, too. And here was Bob in that gathering, that sharing, telling people his deepest, darkest secret that everybody knew anyway. Everybody in town knew that Bob was a drunk. But as far as Bob was concerned, it was a very, very vital, very secretive part of his life. And he asked for their prayers, and immediately Henry said, I will make Bob my cause. And she began earnestly to pray for him. Even once, just a week before I had called, she was guided in one of her meditations by the Spirit, and she went to Bob and suggested to him that he never drink again. You must never touch alcohol again. Of course, he laughed at her, you know. It was impossible to not. And then I called. So she brought me over and she interviewed me to make sure I was a bona fide, that I was a real drunk. Now, normally I had interviewed before to prove I wasn't a drunk, and here I am given a chapter and verse of everything I've done, and she finally, when she was satisfied that I was a rum hound, she risked it, and she called Ann Smith and said, Ann, bring Bob over. I've got a guy here that can help him. And Ann started a hem and haw and come up with one excuse after another about why she couldn't come over, and they were all just excuses. Didn't work. Henry kept pushing and pushing and pushing until finally Ann said, Henry, we can't come over. Bob came home this afternoon with a potted plant for me for Mother's Day, and he put it on the kitchen table. He's now under that table. He's more potted than the plant. I couldn't get him over to you if his life depended on it. Please, we have to skip this. And Henry said, no, we won't skip it. Mister pointed to me, can you come back tomorrow? And I said, yes. He said, well, you come back tomorrow for dinner, and I'll have Bob over here. And I went back and spent a nice night and uneventful Sunday, and I showed up back at the gatehouse the next evening, and I met Bob Smith. Another Vermonter, 15 years my senior. Bob was a proctologist, a rectal surgeon. He used to tell this joke. They had a joke about him in the medical profession. You bet your ass when you went to Bob Smith because you never knew if he was going to be drunk or sober. He knew it. I mean, he had lost everything. He had lost everything he had. When he showed up, he was in poor, poor shape. He was a mess. And I took one look at him and I said, gee, I bet you could use a drink. And right away I could see him soften up a little bit. I guess he said, this guy knows what it's all about. You know, he was very nervous. So we went in to have dinner. And we're eating, and he was so shaky. The food was going all over the table. He was so embarrassed, and I noticed it and took pity on him, and I said, listen, we'll eat later. even though I was hungry. I said, come on, we'll grab a bite later. Let's go in and talk. And he was grateful. You could see that he wanted to escape. We went into a little study that Henry had, and we sat down. I mean, we were almost knee to knee. It was such a small room. And I said, I guess, realizing what Silky had told me, the second smartest thing I could have said that night. I said to him, Doc, I need your help. And wait a minute, he said, I'm here to be helped by you. Why would you need my help? And I told him everything about me. Like Silky said, I talked about my alcoholism and then what I had found and how much I needed to find somebody else to try and help in order to help myself. And he listened and didn't say much. And apparently on the way over, he said to his wife, Annie, he said, Annie, I'm going to give this bum 15 minutes and then come in and say there's been a train wreck or a car wreck and I've got to leave. And the 15 minutes lasted for 5 hours. And when it was over, he came out and put his arms around me and he said to his wife, honey, can we take him home with us? I think he can help me. She said, sure. A couple of days later, when the hotel had run out, I moved into Ardmore Avenue with Bob and Ann Smith and their 2 children, Sue and Bob Jr. And the love and the grace and the beauty that flowed out of that hallowed home I will never find again equaled on the face of the earth. I was immediately made Uncle Bill to the children. I was given young Bob's bed. He was put on a cot. Every day when we got up in the morning after breakfast, we would go up to Ann. Annie had a little sewing room, and we would sit there together, Bob and I, and we would read from the good book, and we'd pray. Pray aloud, and then we'd meditate. And then we'd share a little bit about ourselves. And then we'd pray again, and when it would end, Annie always ended those meetings with, faith without works is dead. And we would leave, and I'd go off to work, and Bob would go off to whatever little practice he had left, and Ann would stay home and keep the house. And day after day went by, and Bob got sober. It was a warm, beautiful time. And we talked about this kernel of an idea that we had of one alcoholic helping another. That could be revolutionary. That could have some significance. And Bob agreed. It was almost divine. Finally, after 2 weeks, a little over 2 weeks, Bob at breakfast announced to Ann and I that he was going to attend the AMA convention in Atlantic City. He hadn't missed one over 30 years in medicine. He wasn't going to miss one now, especially that he was sober, because he didn't remember if he ever went to one sober. And Ann said, please don't go. You get really wrecked at those things. He said, honey, we've got to test the water. This fella can't stay here forever. We've got to go. And if it works out all right, he can go back to New York, and I can work here, and he can work there, getting other people sober. And he was right. The deal was dead. I couldn't make anybody pay for our expenses. I had to go back and find work and get my wife out of that damn department store. So I agreed, let him go, we'll test the water. And Bob left, went to Atlantic City the next day. And as he tells the story, he got drunk as the train pulled out of town. We found him 5 days later. A nurse had found him downtown, an ex-nurse, in a bar, and she and her husband brought him home and tried to get him sober because he was a mess. And when that failed, they called us up to come and get him. And broken-hearted, Ann and I drove out to collect Bob. I was going to go home, bring him back, and catch a train out. There was a joke. This thing didn't work. He had my best shot. I was wrong. I've been wrong before. I'll survive. On the way out, though, Ann said to me, Bill, could you please stay a few days longer? We need to get him sober. He has an operation to perform in a couple of days, and if he fails that, we lose the theater. If we lose the theater, we lose the hospital. It's the last one that'll allow him to practice in town. If we lose that, we have to go bankrupt. We're that desperate. And for her sake, I stayed. And together we got him sober. It was horrific, but we did. We got him sober. And after a couple of days, day of the operation, I drove him into the hospital. He was shaking so badly, I stopped and I got him a bottle of beer to calm his nerves, and he was grateful, and he drank it down. We pulled up to the hospital, and he got out, and he walked up the steps, and he turned around, though, and he came back to the car, and he said, "Bill, I'm going to go through with this." And I said, "Go through with it." I was sick of him. I really didn't want any part of it. Go. And I went back to wait, and when he got the call, I'd come and collect him and bring him home, and then I'd leave. So I went back to the house, and that was at 7 in the morning. 10 o'clock came, no Bob. We called the hospital. The operation had been performed. The patient lived, thank God. And no Bob. 12 o'clock, no Bob. 2 o'clock, no Bob. Finally, I made reservations for the 6:30 train. Confirmed it. I'm leaving. Going back to New York. And then at 5, a cab pulled up outside. And Annie went over to the window, and she looked through the curtains, and she said, "It's him." I said, "How does he look?" I said, "I can't tell." And he came in carrying his bag, and he put it down, and you spouses that are married to us, you know that moment when you're trying to size your friend up. And Annie just looked at him, and finally she said, as she had said so many times before, "Honey, where have you been? We've been worried sick. Where have you been?" Where had he been? He'd been all over the city of Akron, to everybody and anybody that he had ever harmed. And he made amends to each and every one of them. And if he owed them money, he made a promise of restitution. And that's what he meant when he said he was going through with this. He was going through one of the steps that we talked about. That was the 10th of June, 1935, and he never drank again until he died today. And I didn't go home to New York that night. I stayed. I was so happy. He was so happy. The next morning he said, "Willie, you and I are not going to stay sober talking to each other. We got to find another drunk." And I said, "I'm game. I'll stay." And he called up the Akron hospital, and he said, "Hey, this is Doc Smith. I've got a guy here from New York that's got a cure for drinking. Do you have anybody down there we can talk to?" And the smart aleck nurse said, "Well, what about you, Doc?" He has. She said, "Are you sober?" He said, "Yes." "Well, that's good enough for me. We've got a fellow right now. He's in restraints. He's tied up in bed. He just blackened the eyes of the head nurse. I mean, he's used to be on the town council, a Southern boy, a lawyer. Will he do? Will he do?" And Smitty said, "Yeah, give him some sedatives. We'll be down by and by." And they did. And without my knowing it, too, he had the man moved into a private room so we could talk to him in private. Now, in those days, when you were taken out of the ward and put in a private room, it meant only one thing: you were dying. So you imagine the state of this fellow when we showed up. He's strapped in bed, knows he's dying, and as far as he's concerned, when we walk in, we're the undertakers come to measure the body. He is so frightened, the sweat pouring off his body. He's tied in bed, can't move. He's looking up at us, and I go over and I said, "Mister, can we talk?" He said, "Are you kidding me? Where am I going?" And I started to talk, and Bob started to talk, and we told our stories. And you could see him going back and forth, one to the other, beginning to realize that indeed he wasn't going to die. And you could see the peace of God settle over him when he realized this, and the color come back into his face, and the sweat stop. And he sort of lifted up a little bit off the bed, but he listened to what we had to say. He wasn't going anywhere. And when we finished, we said, "What do you think?" And he said, "Gee, fellas, I'm happy for both of you. I truly am, but it's too late for me." He said, "I dare not leave here. I'll kill somebody. I know in my next rage, my next drunk, I'll kill somebody. I've asked to be committed to the Ohio State Hospital for the insane. I dare not walk out of this place again. I haven't given up on God. God gave up on me. But I wish you all the best of luck. Thanks, but it's too late." We turned to go, and I, to this day, don't know if it was Bob or I, went back to him and said, "Mister, wait a minute. Maybe we missed something. Could we come back and talk to you again a little bit? Maybe there's something we didn't quite get across." And, "Oh," he said, "please come back. Oh, please do. You know how lonely this drying out is. You people know the story. You know what it's like. They hate us here. They hate the sight of us, the sound of us, the smell of us. They don't come near us from one moment of the day to the next. Oh, please come back. I'd love to see you again. We had half a sale. Half. We'll take it. A couple of days later, we did get back. And he had been taken out of the room. He was put in a ward. We walked in the door, and he was sitting up in his bed talking to his wife when he spots us. He lets out a roar. There they are! There was a fella that they had certified dead, I'm sure, got up from his bed and walked home. This guy started to jump. Honey, these are the guys. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't an hallucination. These are the fellas I was telling you about. Tell her. We're trying to calm him down. Tell her what you told me. I can't, honey, this guy pointed to me. He's a stockbroker from New York, out here on business. Came to talk to me. He's a drunk like I am. Listen to what he has to say. This other fella, he's a Heine doctor right here in the hospital. He's a drunk too. Tell her what you told me. And we began to tell her the story. He said, I wasn't dreaming. That's it. And he kept saying, I told you. That's it. That's the way I heard it. And we finished. He said, if they can do it, I can do it. Honey, get my clothes. I'm going home. And that was Bill D, AA number 3. And we had our first group that still meets today in Akron after 15 years. And what was most important was here was a man, not in the Oxford group, but a stranger to it. And yet, he identified with us. We had something. I went back to New York. 2 years later, we had 40 drunks, sober, 6 months or more. A miracle of its time. We were desperately broke. We wanted this to grow. We needed money. Somebody said, write a book. Books sell. Take the money and grow. Open up rehabs all over the country. Put a drunk in each one of them. You'll make a fortune. You'll clean up. Great idea. Let's write a book. I didn't know how to write. Smithy didn't know how to write. Nobody could write. We did, though, form the Works Publishing Company. Begged maybe $5 grand from friends. Even Charlie Towns gave in some money. But we had the money, and we started to write. As bad as we were, I wrote my story. Wrote a couple other pieces. Smithy wrote his. We got a couple other drunks, 20 some odd, to write their stories. We edited them, of course, to make them proper. Got Silky to put a doctor's opinion in the book. We had everything going for us. It was wonderful. It took about 2 years. Wonderful. We were on a roll. We even had the Reader's Digest. When this thing is published, it's going to give us a feature article. We were going. I mean, things were really rolling. Until we discovered we were missing one key ingredient, how it works. We didn't have any description of how the program worked, really, of any significance. When people would say to us, how does this thing you've got going here work? I would say it works fine. That was all I could say. But we didn't have, now we had 6 steps by then, or stages, or whatever you wanted to call them, 6 ideas. The 5 that I had spoken about before, and we added one, of course, that we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. So we had a little 6-step program. We had a lot of little ritual stuff, but we didn't know how it works. And we had to get the book published. I mean, people were on our heels. We owed a lot of money. One evening, sitting around my brother-in-law's house in Brooklyn Heights, Lois was off working in that damn department store. Still. We were sitting around talking about how it works. Now, we in New York had broken away from the Oxford group. We had broken our association with them in order to, anonymity had a great deal to do with it. We also wanted to allow Catholics and Jews to join it, and being that this was so fundamentalist, we wanted to open it up for that. The people in Ohio were about ready to do that also, but they weren't quite there. The majority of the fellows in New York were card-carrying agnostics, I guess you'd call them. They were sober and they had some sort of higher power. But for most of them, it was the trolley that brought them to the meetings. That was their higher power. And they were of a mind then that we would write a book and make it scientific. We would not mention God, because God wasn't selling at that particular time. We wanted to make it science, make it the future, because the World's Fair had just opened up in Flushing, the world of tomorrow. And we wanted to be a part of that new age, that new world. So let's not get into the God stuff. And I agreed. I mean, I wanted this book to sell because we needed the dough. I agreed. And Lois had come home during this conversation, and she was in the kitchen making a pot of coffee for us drunks to drink. Well, all of a sudden we heard the coffee pot come slamming down, and she came out of the kitchen, and she threw everybody out of the house. She couldn't throw me out. I lived there. One guy I'd never seen her that angry. He went out the window, literally right out the window. And I said, "What's gotten into you?" And she went over to me and she said, "Mister, you're going to get drunk." She was furious. I said, "What do you mean I'm going to get drunk?" "Because you forgot who got you sober." And she left and she went upstairs. And I'd never seen her that angry. I wasn't going to follow her. Good night, good night. I stayed downstairs thinking about what she had said. We had a little room underneath the staircase that had a little cotnet that I used to go in and lie down on and do my heavy thinking. So I went in there and I lay down, and there was a little clipboard over the bed, and I took it down and I began to think about those moments, those realizations in my life since I've been sober, and how often there was this personal God involved in anything that had of any good importance, significance. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Lois was right. So I took those 6 ideas that we had adopted and I began to look at them from a different angle. I said, they're a little too heavy to swallow this way, and I began to cut them down into little pieces. And before you know it, I had 12 ideas. 12. I took those 6 and I cut them up to 12 ideas. I stopped at number 12 for one simple reason, one reason alone. There were 12 apostles. And I said, if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for us. And I identified God in the second step and called him by name in the third. And having finished this, I said, this is it. I'm not going to take an argument. This book had to be published. It had to be. When I came up out of the room, 2 fellows had come into the house, didn't know how angry Lois had been. They were drinking her coffee. And I sat down amongst them and I began to read them what I had just written. And they listened and they didn't say a word. And finally one fellow said, "Bill, it sounds okay to us if you would add only one thing." I said, "What's that?" "Whenever you mention the word God, would you please just say, as we understood him." God as we understood him. And I said, okay. We had our 12 steps. We had how it works. So we went to publish the book. The only thing missing was a title. In modesty, I suggested the Bill Wilson movement, and they shot that down in 5 minutes. And somebody else suggested, how about the way out? I said, that sounds great. And then we were lucky, a fellow was going through Washington, one of us, and he checked out at the patent office and discovered that there were already 12 titles the way out. We didn't want to be number 13, so we went back to thinking. And somebody else said there were 100 men sober in 39 just before the publication of the book. Somebody said, what about 100 men? What a title for a book. And I said, it's got a ring to it, you know. Great. When you know the first woman showed up. We couldn't say 100 men plus a woman because they said, what's the matter with women? Yeah. So back to the drawing board. Now, one meeting one night, poor fellow that was insane from alcohol, used to work on the New Yorker, kept mentioning anonymous alcoholics, over and over again. That sort of caught on. And somebody said, no, make the alcoholic first, make it Alcoholics Anonymous. We had referred to ourselves for a long time as an unknown bunch of drunks, and now we had Alcoholics Anonymous. I said, that's great, that'll work. So we had the title of our book, which became the title of our society. And we went ahead and we published 5,000 copies. And we sold 102. The girl bought 2. We couldn't give it away. But that's another night and another story. I have a train to catch and a friend to bury. Invite me back and I'll tell you about the fun we had getting this going. Suffice it to say, we met this summer in Cleveland. We had our first international convention. We're over 100,000. We're all over the world. I can't tell you the numbers of copies of this book that have been sold. It continues to sell. It's very, very gratifying. We grew, thank God. Let me close. This book, it's a suggestion only. We realize we don't have all the answers. God and His infinite mercy and wisdom, He'll let you know what you have to do. Just make sure that your relationship with Him is right. Ask Him in your morning prayers, what can I do for the fellow or the gal that is still suffering? And the answers will come, believe me, if your own house is in order, but you can't, none of us, give away something you don't have. Abandon yourself to God as you understand God. Clear away the wreckage of your past. Give freely of what you find here and become a part of us. Become a part of AA. AA is an utter simplicity encased in a mystery that nobody, and I mean nobody, not even myself, understands perfectly. All we know is that our strength comes from our weakness. The fact that we know what we are. We know it to the core of our soul. That's where our strength comes from. Humility is a prerequisite to any type of resurrection. And pain is not only the price we have to pay, but it's the very touchstone of any spiritual rebirth. You have to go through a little pain. This group is celebrating its first anniversary. I mean, that is significant. That is important. Be grateful for the experience that that's brought about. But don't, believe me, don't depend upon it for 1 minute for the needs of today. The art of life is to live one day at a time, 1 minute, 1 moment, and make that moment as perfect as you can. I want to thank you for allowing me to share some of the moments of my life and Bob's. Lois was right, it did help me. I feel a lot better than when I walked in here. So I'm grateful for the advice that was given to me. I hope that you invite me back after this ordeal. That's what it's going to be. So I can share with you in fellowship, because I will need your strength. I was with Bob just this weekend. I went out, we had one little piece of unfinished business to accomplish. And I went out to talk to him about it, and I spent the day at his home. And I want you to know, although he was in a great deal of pain, I had all of his attention, every fiber. He was with me the whole time, and we talked and discussed and shared opinions. And news of that meeting will come out shortly, and we'll have another meeting in April to make the final decision. It's about changing the Board of Trustees to make it predominantly made up of alcoholics versus non-alcoholics. Because I often felt that Bob and I are the only alcoholics on the board, and what happens if we die? Little realizing that Bob was to die, because nobody would then know anybody on the board. Well, Bob agreed, and we're going to have the meeting to let you decide. And then at the end of the meeting, I had to leave to catch a train to come home, and he walked me to the door. And passing by the hall closet, he reached up and he took down this old Irish country hat, and he gave it to me. He said, "Bill," he said, "put this on." He said, "It's raining outside, and we don't want you to catch cold because you have a great deal of work to do." Now, some of you might know the history about Bob and I and this hat, but I have wanted it for the last 15 years. First day I laid eyes on it, first week I was in that house. I've wanted this hat. I was speechless. I mean, I've stolen it from him about 12 times. Lois keeps mailing it back to him. And I just couldn't say a word. I just took the hat, and I said, "Oh, man," before he changes his mind, you know. And I walked out of the house, and I walked down the path to the car when, I don't know what made me turn around, but I did. And apparently he'd come out on the porch to see me off. And I look back at him. This is my partner, 15 years now, a man I've never had a hard word with. For me, that's very unusual. He had this big grin on his face. And all he said to me is, hey, Bill, he said, don't louse this thing up. Keep it simple. My God, he'd been saying that to me for 15 years, too. Keep it simple. I just nodded and turned away, little realizing that was going to be the last time I would see him alive. And I didn't know it. Oh, I wish I had known it. There was so much to be said. I didn't know it. But then tonight, coming here, I went into my hall closet and took this hat down. And it's then I realized he knew it. Bob knew it. You see, it wasn't raining in Akron. He had just found a beautiful, loving way to say goodbye. Pass this on to me. And in so doing, teach me what this is all about. Just passing it on, one alcoholic to another. Thank you. Good night, and God bless you.